My name is Danny Blank, and I have been with ECHO since 1994 and work as the farm manager. ECHO is an organization that provides agricultural assistance to those working internationally with the poor. We equip people with agricultural resources in the form of practical training, seeds, and information to help families experience sustained and improved food production and a greater quality of life. Today I want to speak about the topic of extending the growing season. It is a talk about how to move toward year-round production through innovative farming practices and perennial crops. The focus of this talk is primarily for those who live in tropical and subtropical areas. It is also geared towards small-scale farmers, those who are farming really small pieces of land, usually less than 2 hectares. It is also a talk for mainly subsistence-level farmers who live largely from the food they grow. We're going to talk today about a lot of farming techniques, different crops, and systems that lead toward greater production. But before we do, I want to begin by explaining some very important characteristics of tropical climates. Heat and light come from the sun and are the one free resource that produces food in the form of maybe maize or rice, or fuel in the form of wood that comes from trees. Many don't know this, but the tropics are actually capable of producing more energy and protein per hectare than seasonally cold climates found in countries like the United States, China, and Russia. This is due to the abundance of sunlight and heat found in the tropics spread over the full year. The result is tremendous plant growth and year-round growth and great diversity, especially in the humid tropics. This is rarely represented, however, on farms in the tropics. In fact, the tropics are often where you find the greatest physical suffering and incredibly low overall agricultural production. Countries with the greatest percentage of malnourished people overwhelmingly exist in tropical areas. So it is important we understand that poverty, hunger, and malnourishment is not the result of the limit of tropical climates. The causes of poverty are complicated and challenging. They are deeply connected to your country's history, past and present regional conflicts, poor infrastructure in the form of poor roads or access to good markets, or the absence of good agriculture education and training that results in poor land care practices. These are real challenges, but I want to communicate this principle that it is not for lack of potential in tropical climates. There may be immediate limits in a particular area. You may be lacking quality seed, supplies, or have inherently poor soil conditions, or lack sufficient water. But the sunlight and heat found in the tropics allows for that continued plant growth. The other issues can be dealt with, but the abundance potential is there. Even in some of very dry climates that aren't even in the tropics, such as in Israel or California, you have an incredible production of vegetables and fruits through developed irrigation systems. And this is so true of tropical environments. Outside of arid areas, they have a tremendous capacity for food production. But it requires different systems of food production, innovative practices, and a stronger dependence on perennial crops. A good portion of these sessions today will focus on perennial crops. By definition, a perennial crop is one that lives beyond a year. Trees and bananas, for example, are perennials. Sugarcane and cassava are also perennials, but they're managed and harvested on a yearly cycle. In contrast, annuals live less than 1 year and usually have a very distinct growing season. Maize, most beans, and vegetables are annuals. They live and die in a several-month period. In places like the United States and in Europe, there is winter, these incredibly cold temperatures that exist that confine growing to a 4 to 5 month window. And so in the US, United States, and in Europe, there is a strong dependence on annual crops due to these cold temperatures. And annual crops are ideal and necessary in these climates, and usually always outperform yields in the tropical climates. There are a number of reasons for this, and one significant one is that there are very long days of sunlight that results in enormous potential for crops to have high yields. In the tropics, the day length changes less from season to season. The hours of sunlight in the day over a 4-month period, for example, in America, might average 14 hours in a day over a 4 to 5 month period, whereas near the equator, the average may be around 12 hours per day. So this limits overall production in the tropics. If you compare 4 months of summer in America to 4 months of production in Kenya, the yields will be far higher on average in America versus Kenya. But let's take a look at a different scenario. What if you compared 4 months of production in America to 12 months in Kenya? The Kenyan yields will far exceed those than what you will achieve in the cooler climates like in America. And this goes back to what I said earlier. Tropical environments have overall greater production of energy and protein per square meter than in the cool climates that you find in Russia, in Europe, in North America. But it requires more diversified and innovative systems and crops that capture sunlight over the entire year. It may be the energy comes from cassava or bananas instead of maize, and the protein comes from tree leaves instead of soybeans. But this means a farmer with a hectare of land in Cambodia or Haiti or Nicaragua or Malawi or Congo can actually have more food production in a year's time than a farmer who may have 1 hectare in America. However, this abundance is rarely realized. Most farms I have observed fail to demonstrate this intrinsic quality of the tropics, this principle that governs the tropics, this being 12 months of good sunlight and temperatures allowing for year-round production. Much of the farming stops in the tropics after the rainy season ends, and it is undesirable because there is this lack of moisture, and most annual crops require a sufficient level of moisture. And so what you have is 2 seasons. You have your rainy season or farming season, and you have a dry season. But if farmers do not have a decent percent of crops on their farm capturing the 12 months of sunlight and limit themselves to a 5-month crop cycle, it is far more difficult to support a family on a small piece of land. It's okay if you have several hectares, 3 or 5 or 10, and you're growing just rice and sweet potatoes and vegetables. You can achieve enough yield on the larger sizes of land and confine yourself to the rainy season. But for those, say, with 1 hectare of land, it is difficult. And in fact, when the sun is hitting the ground instead of leaves during that dry season, this free resource, the sun, can actually work against you rather than for you. And so scarcity will usually be a problem in the tropics for those who depend on rainy season production alone and have access to less than 2 hectares of land. Fortunately, there's good news. God has created a tremendous diversity of food plants. For example, here at Echo, on just 2 hectares of our demonstration area, we grow over 150 species of food plants. About half of these are perennial. We can find food every day, fruits and vegetables, forage for our animals, and wood, and other valuable products, even months into the dry season and even at the end of the dry season, because of creative farming practices and because of a strong dependence on perennials. So the tropics are far more fruitful when there's a strong emphasis on perennial crops, which are faithful, highly productive, and easier to manage. and when there is year-round production, as the tropics allow, and when there is greater diversity, which the tropics boast. And again, the reality on the ground is very different, and this potential is being far from realized. In these pictures, you will see many realities and challenges facing small-scale farmers in the tropics. There's evidence of poor land care practices, massive soil erosion, burnt and bare ground, and declining soil fertility and low yields. In this picture, you see the reality of small farms. This is a huge reality for most farmers throughout the tropics. On the African, Asian continent, the average land area per person is 1.6 hectares, and many have even smaller pieces of land than that. And the conditions for most farm families throughout the tropics is a very physically demanding lifestyle, both in the farming and just in the day-to-day care. It takes work to live. Carrying products to market is a huge challenge and a reality that must be considered in discussing ideas and promoting systems that are sensible for farmers. They must go huge distances many times, carrying products on their backs, on their heads, or through a burrow or on a cart. And also the huge work that goes into preparing fields by hand. The traditional farming practices not only take their toll on people, but they take their toll on the land. You can see in this picture here that these slopes, which would best be covered, the edges of these steep slopes would best be covered with trees, but instead farmers are having to farm the most marginal of conditions. And in this picture here, you see that fire is part of the farming system, and especially where it's part of the annual cycle, it can be very devastating. It's really hard to improve soils in the long run when that organic matter is burned and the soils are robbed of valuable fertility. So the land groans, and yet there remains within it this possibility of abundance. It's calling out for stewards. Here in this picture, you see here in this picture, you see the headwaters of the Nile River. It's actually the Blue Nile. It's in Ethiopia, and it's the color of the water here is reddish brown, and it's not the color of water. God made water clear, and that's the way water is meant to be. But you can see massive amounts of soil being washed off fields. Emperor Selassie, who was the emperor in Ethiopia for many years, visited Egypt, where the Nile eventually makes its way to. And he stooped down on the ground and picked up a handful of soil, and he said, "This is my country." And that soil came from way up 2 countries back, starting in Ethiopia, going through Sudan, and then into Egypt. And he recognized and made the connection of how farming practices there in Ethiopia was impacting the quality of rivers and how it was impacting the quality of land in Ethiopia as soil is being washed away. In this next picture, you see not only soil being lost from fields, but actually whole sections of farm being lost in the form of gully erosion. And even larger example of this in Haiti, where you see what was probably once farmland is now lost. And in this picture, which also comes from Haiti, you see massive amounts of soil transported down the river and into the ocean. And it leaves behind soils that you see here in this Ethiopian field of teff that are lacking proper nutrition. In the meantime, not only the land suffers, as we talked about, but the crown of God's creation, his children, suffer. The food situation for small-scale farmers in the tropics is very serious. The odds are stacked against them if practices do not change. I think it is important to see how desperate the situation is when people rely strictly on rainy season production. The average maize production in Africa, Central America, and Caribbean is around 1.5 tons per hectare. And I want to just talk about this for a moment, where we're going to discuss some statistics and wrestle with them and think about them and how they're related to people's livelihoods and daily living. In the United States, the average maize yield is 8.3 tons per hectare. In Italy, it's 9.6. Argentina, way in the southern hemisphere, is 5.3. But when you look in the tropics, the averages are very, very low. Haiti, 0.8. Malawi, 1.4. Mozambique, 0.9 tons per hectare. That's 900 kilograms per hectare of land. These numbers may not mean that much to us until we apply the size of land that people have to farm. And then we realize how grave, how serious the situation really is. Let's use an example, say, from Malawi, where the staple food there is maize, and people depend on it. The farm sizes, I've been told there, average around 1 hectare per family. And so you have this overall size of a farm it's going to limit how much you can produce. The average in Malawi is around 1.4 tons of maize per hectare. And remember, these are now averages. These take into account commercial production. And so there's going to be people who are experiencing much greater than 1.4, and there's going to be a whole lot of people who are experiencing much less than 1.4. According to FAO, it takes a minimum of 1.2 tons of maize to feed a family. And if the average in Malawi is 1.4 tons per hectare per year, and they're usually only getting 1 crop of maize per year because of the long dry season, this is barely enough to feed a family. And what about drought? A year of drought? What about pestilence? What about conditions during storage? Molds and rats impacting a family's stored grain. The margin of error is very small. And this is one reason families struggle to move beyond the subsistence level. And this is why you see families struggling to make ends meet year after year after year after year. And food aid can further complicate the situation. It's not a long-term solution. It can degrade self-worth and family values. So how do we create and encourage more safety nets, more food production on these small farms? Today we're going to talk about enabling farmers to, first of all, improve rainy season production. That is one key component. That is the time when you have sufficient rainfall. You have sufficient rainfall to produce your important food staple crops. But we're also going to look at innovative ways to farm during the dry season. Both are areas that need improvement. And the third thing we're going to look at is enabling farmers through perennial-based systems to take full advantage of that 12 months of available sunlight and heat. It's going to mean greater diversity, a strong dependence on perennials, and integration on small farms, extending the growing season to year-round production. There are real challenges. You have pestilence, disease, fire, drought, roaming goats, degraded lands, and the whole presence of daily human challenges, sin, there's suffering. But in spite of these forces, God has put principles in place that govern the earth and the diversified resources in the form of sunlight and soil and rain and plants and animals that when these gifts are carefully received and properly stewarded can lead toward abundance. So this completes the introduction to extending the growing season. The outline that we will be following for this presentation will first discuss farming practices. These will be farming practices that truly extend the season, that both improve rainy season production and move it beyond the rainy season into the dry season. The second session will then focus on fuel wood. We're going to be talking about how to produce more fuel, wood, and wood products for construction and other things on the farm. And we will also then move into a session discussing fencing and how to really truly exclude animals, to keep crops and animals separate but related. And the next session will be on forage, how to intensify, how to increase animal production based on perennial forages. There will be a session then on fruits and a session then on foliage or perennial greens, those plants you can plant once and harvest for 30 years. And these are all critical components in moving toward diversified year-round production.